Great. Okay, welcome everyone. This is the first of 4 webinars that we're going to be running. We're focusing today on the first 2 steps of the World Health Organization guidelines for wheelchair provision. So we'll be focusing today on referral and assessment. We have a few learning objectives, 5 of them, as you can see there. We'd first like to start to tell you a little bit about the ISWP as well as our integration subcommittee. Which is the group that's been working on these updates. And after that, we're going to tell you a little bit about the WHO for those of you who aren't familiar with the World Health Organization guidelines. And primarily, we're going to talk about the 8 steps, or their 8 recommended steps, and how the ISWP then created some online educational modules around those 8 steps. And after that, we'll talk a little bit about how we've been doing this work over the past 2 years, give you some of our general results, and then we'll focus in on exactly the additions and updates we are recommending for the steps 1 and 2, which again are referral and assessment. Thanks, Krithika.
Thank you, Mara. So I will start off. My name is Krithika Kandawale. I am the Research and Training Coordinator for ISWP, and I'm so excited to be part of this project. So I'll start off with our background. As a background, 70 million people require an appropriate wheelchair to enable them to participate in their communities. The World Health Organization estimates that only 15% have access to the products and services they require. Lack of appropriate trained personnel to provide the services is one of the key barriers to meeting the global wheelchair need. The enactment of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability and the publication of the World Health Organization guidelines on the provision of manual wheelchairs and the wheelchair personnel training packages raised global awareness of the immense and urgent need. ISWP, to build on this momentum, was established in 2015 to serve as a global resource for wheelchair service standards and provision through advocacy, training and testing, standards, evidence-based practice, innovation, and a platform for information exchange. University of Pittsburgh's extensive experience in wheelchairs and mobility enabled us to receive a grant to launch the International Society of Wheelchair Professionals in 2015. We are funded by the United States Agency for International Development. Here are some of our global organizations and initiatives promoting assistive technology. The International Society of Prosthetics and Orthotics, ISPO, ISWP, and WHO's Global Alliance of Assistive Technology Organization, also known as GATE. We focus on improving the lives of wheelchair users, especially those in less resourced countries, by advocating for governments to pay for appropriate wheelchairs and services, training clinicians on fitting clients with appropriate wheelchairs and educating wheelchair users on how to use and maintain their wheelchairs, improving the quality of wheelchairs by working with manufacturers, suppliers, and wheelchair technicians. Everything we do is based on research and/or has the opportunity to contribute to additional research to improve the lives of wheelchair users worldwide. And we are going to focus on training and education in this session. So these are some of our training and education initiatives. You can learn more about them on our website. I'm going to drop the link to all of them in the chat. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank our volunteers, especially the training working group members who all volunteered their valuable time. They have tirelessly worked on our projects and have dedicated their valuable expertise. And so without them, we could have never completed any of these projects. And here is the link to our website to learn more about these resources. If you would also like to get involved in our working group activities, feel free to email me, and I will add my email in the chat again. So the integration subcommittee falls under the training working group. We have 10 members from various universities and nonprofit organizations. The purpose of this committee is to integrate wheelchair provisioning into pre-professional training curricula via evidence-based training materials and methodologies. And these are our great looking members of the team. So the starting point for ISWP online courses is the release of the World Health Organization service training packages over the years. We started off with the release of the ISWP basic online courses in the year 2016, and then followed by managers, stakeholders, and the training of trainers course in basic and intermediate in 2019. Our foundation of our online course is the WHO 8 steps, and you can find the courses in our website. I'm going to drop again the link for the link. And sorry. So I just wanted to mention these online courses are currently being used by universities, nonprofit organizations, multi-tenant access, which have multi-tenant access features. And the availability of these courses will significantly reduce the number of in-person training days, as well as the cost, and expand the number of people who can be trained. The online modules were created using Articulate Storylines 360 and resides on our website. And they're freely accessible to anyone. So I just dropped the chat again. I'm sorry, the link again in the chat. So you're welcome to explore them on our website. I will now hand it over to Amira for the rest of the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Krithika. So if you want to move on to the next slide, what you can see here is that the available ISWP online courses, we do have a number of them. Starting from the far left, we have the wheelchair service training package, and that's the basic package, and that's what I'll be talking about mostly. There's also the wheelchair service training package for managers, the wheelchair service training package for stakeholders, the trainer of trainers basic package, and the training of trainers for the intermediate package. We'll be focusing mostly or exclusively on the service training package, the basic package, which is on the far left. Next slide, please, Krithika. And so if we look at the training resources timeline, what you can see highlighted in blue there is that the basic guidelines came out, or the basic course came out in 2012, directly after the WHO released their guidelines. We also then published the intermediate guidelines for providers, as well as managers and stakeholders, and training of trainers. What you can see in 2019 was we took a review of all of these courses. So we looked at the ISWP online modules, which is what we're talking about now. Next slide, please, Krithika. So in brief, you can see in 2008, the WHO put out their guidelines for provision of wheelchairs in less resource settings. And then in 2012, is when ISWP started putting together these online modules. And so originally these the ISWP's modules were in-person option only. So I'm referring to them as online now because since COVID happened, they've been only exclusively offered online. But when these courses were originally put together, they were only offered in person, and they were 40 hours long. And these 40 hours were comprised of two parts. So the first part was theoretical, and the second part was practical. Next slide, please. And so what you can see within these training resources, we had our ISWP content, which was comprised of the WHO stuff plus a couple other resources. And what we decided to do in 2019 was try and provide some of these asynchronously or in hybrid option. And so next slide, please. And so what we decided after that, after 2019, sort of as COVID came along, was that more and more individuals were needing these courses, and obviously they were only accessing them online. And so what we were finding was the online courses had a number of issues which needed to be addressed. And so the first was the flexibility constraints. And so there was no way to change the articulate storyline very well in terms of the graphics that were used, the languages it was offered in, etc. It was also difficult for us to continue updating or maintaining the currency of the content within those modules. And we realized that the content and balance needed to evolve on the basis of experience and what was happening in the world. And so we realized that we really did need to update these online modules. Next slide, please, Krithika. And so we decided that the modules were ready for an update, and we had two original goals. What we had wanted to do was streamline and reorganize the content that was included within these online modules, as well as update any content with new knowledge that has been in any evidence-based journals since the original or the origination of WHO guidelines in 2008. Next slide, please, Krithika. And so how did we go about doing this? Well, our integration subcommittee, so Krithika spoke about that earlier, we reviewed the World Health Organization basic level reference manual. We did this over the course of the year. So our little group, we went through the whole manual step by step over the course of about 10 months. Once we'd reviewed that manual amongst ourselves, specific topics were sent to subject matter experts for further review. And so for example, we're talking about steps 1 and 2 today, and we sent steps 1 and 2 that we are reviewed portions of steps 1 and 2 to a few particular experts who we'll thank later in this webinar for them to further review our work. And then, so that all finished about last August, September. And since that time, the three of us, Sarah, I, and Krithika, have been working together to create these webinars with our updated information on the World Health Organization 8 steps and some recommendations about how we as ISWP are going to update our online modules. And so if we look at the next slide, this is just the same thing, but shown over a timeline. You can see that starting in 2020 was when we started reviewing the reference manual. Over the summer of last year is when the subject matter experts provided feedback. And then over the last 8 months, the three of us, again, Sarah, Krithika, and I, have been working to incorporate all the feedback from our internal members as well as our subject matter experts. And so what we've been doing now is all the work that we've been doing is what we're now presenting to you within this first webinar. And so what you can see is, although we had two original goals, which were to streamline the content as well as update the content, we actually found that a third main theme emerged. And what that was that our terminology was quite outdated throughout the manual and throughout the ISWP. So we actually divided our results into 3 major subheadings, the first being terminology, then organization, and then any updated content. Throughout this webinar and the next 3, we've organized our findings by color and by these pictograms on the side of each of those words, just to try and keep things somewhat clear because there were a lot of moving parts. So if we look at the next slide, what you can see is that terminology has been updated throughout the manual, and we'll address the particulars in each webinar. And this terminology was updated throughout based on expert opinion as well as published recommendations. So a few examples would be some of our subject matter experts suggested that rather than using the terminology sitting upright, we should use the word neutral sitting posture. And so we'll talk about that in a minute. And then examples of published recommendations are that pressure ulcer, I think most people are now doing this. The terminology we'll be using is pressure injury, as well as a number of different terms used to describe both body measures and wheelchair components. And I'll talk about both of those things in a little bit more detail shortly. And so then if we look at organization, and we look at the next slide, as I was saying before, go on to the next slide there, please, Krithika. As I was saying before, the original modules were divided very succinctly into theoretical information, which was presented first, and then practical information, which was presented second. And so what happened was there's quite a lot of overlap in the theoretical and the practical information. So what we've done in terms of the information is we've combined the theoretical and practical information throughout. So I'll explain that in just a second. And then what that meant was that we reorganized much of the information within modules. So I'm just going to show you an example. Krithika, if you can go to the next slide. What you'll see is you look at if we look at the far left, you see the WHO modules. They have A1, A2, and all those A's there. Those are the theoretical information. And then if you go further down, you see the B's, and that's the practical information. And so because our original modules were based directly off of those WHO modules, you'll see in the middle column that our modules are lined up exactly the same way. We have all the theoretical information up top, and then we had step 1 through 8 practical information. But if you're taking the course completely online, it becomes very unwieldy to try and do theoretical information and then try and do practical information on your own, which combines all that information together. And we were finding it was quite confusing for users who this information may be new to them, or people looking for a refresher. It was very difficult to find the pertinent information all in one spot. So what we've recommended, and you can see in the far right, is that we've put together all the chunks of information that we felt pertain to each step. So you can see we have A1, 2, and 5, as well as B3, which is assessment interview. All of that is contained in the introduction to the manual and an introduction, sort of like an introduction lecture. And then if you look, we have steps 1, steps 2, steps 3, and 4, and we put all the information pertaining to those steps together in one spot. So if you look at step 3, for example, you can see that we've taken information from B5, which is prescription, information from A6, which is an appropriate wheelchair. So if you think about it, prescription, you need to know what an appropriate wheelchair is in order to prescribe that. So we've taken that information and placed it in the same spot. And then if you look at step 4, which is B6, that's funding and ordering, and we just kept that the way it was. So that's an example of how we modified or reorganized information throughout all the information and put it together into succinct modules. And then the last thing we did was update some content. So I'll talk about that as we go through. There's certain places where we felt that more information was warranted, and so we've added content in there. So I'll bring that up as we get to those specific spots. So overall, that's how the project was run over the year. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to talk specifically about steps 1 and 2 and our recommendations we had for those 2 steps. Next week, we'll talk about steps 3 and 4 and so on through the 4 webinars. So if we go on to the next slide, again, you can see terminology, organization, and content. For steps 1 and 2, we did significant we found significant terminology updates were required, particularly when it comes to body measures. And so we'll talk about that. We did a lot of reorganization as well. And in terms of content, we didn't find there was a whole lot of content that needed to be added to steps 1 and 2, but I'll address that as we get there. So if we go down to the next slide, we're going to spend quite a bit of time now talking about terminology. And so if we think about terminology and why we need to update it, well, we know particularly in the field of wheelchairs that tremendous variation exists in terminology used to describe both postural measures and wheelchair components. So for example, some people call things foot rests, some people call them foot hangers, some people call them foot supports, some people call them wheelchair legs. There's a number of different terms that we all use to talk about the same thing. However, if we use standard terms and definitions, we're more easily able to communicate amongst ourselves. So we know that standard terms and definitions facilitate effective communication among wheelchair providers. So if we're using the same terms, if I'm, here I am in Nova Scotia and I'd like to talk to a colleague in British Columbia in Canada, or perhaps to Sarah in Colombia, if we're all using the same terminology for specific components and specific measures, it facilitates a more effective and error-free communication. Now, we do know we didn't have to come up with these terms. Sorry, Krithika, just go back. We didn't have to come up with these terms on our own. Standard terms and definitions have actually been developed since 2008, but because they were developed after 2008, they have not been reflected in the WHO guidelines, nor are they reflected in the original ISWP online learning modules. So that's why we have updated our terminology. So if we go to the next slide, what we're talking about here in this one is we're talking about steps 1 and 2. And so next slide again, Krithika, most of our terminology updates pertain around sitting upright, and or some of the terminology I'm going to start with is about sitting upright and how we describe sitting upright. So next slide, please. So yeah, this is the first major category of terminology changes throughout the module, and this is spoken about quite a bit. We've changed the term, or we're recommending to change the term sitting upright to a neutral sitting posture. And this is because posture is the way a person's body parts are arranged. And so wherever possible, a well-fitting wheelchair should support wheelchair users in a neutral sitting in an upright posture. So for a wheelchair user who sits all day in the wheelchair needs to provide enough support to help the user to sit in a neutral posture upright comfortably, while also allowing them to move or change positions if they are able. So that's the definition of a neutral sitting posture. And if we go to the next slide, Krithika, why have we decided to change upright sitting to a neutral sitting posture? Well, upright tends to just mean not lying down. So there's not a whole lot of details there. However, we use the term neutral posture. It's quite a bit more specific. Generally, it means that the pelvis is upright and level, that the trunk is upright with the back following its natural curves. The hips and legs are slightly separated, 5 to 8 degrees from midline. Knees and ankles are typically at 90 degrees, and the head is upright and in midline. And so I want you to remember that although for many individuals who use a wheelchair, they may not be able to achieve a neutral sitting posture, for the basic manual or the information that we're providing, we're assuming that the individuals who are receiving a wheelchair only require basic knowledge. And that is that they're able to maintain this neutral posture without a whole lot of extra supports. Okay. And so then in terms of our other changes to terminology, they mostly focus around the assessment and mostly the physical assessment. So if we go to the next slide, what we did was we updated all the terminology for measurements and wheelchair components to align with 2 publications. The first is a clinical application guide to standardize wheelchair seating measures of the body and seating support surfaces. And the second is the glossary of wheelchair terms and definitions. And both of these were published in 2013 by Kelly Waugh and her group in the United States. Next slide, Krithika. So because we're talking about assessment today, mostly I'm going to speak now about the clinical application guide to wheelchair seating measures. We'll talk a little bit more about wheelchair components and terms in the next webinar. So today we'll mostly focus on the wheelchair seating measures. So next slide, please. So we know when we're looking at a wheelchair prescription, we can look at 2 things. We can look at the body measures, so the measures and the angles of the wheelchair user, as well as measuring the support surfaces, which reflect the wheelchair components. So we're actually measuring 2 things. We're measuring the person, and then we also need to look at the measurements of the wheelchair. And so again, although there are many body measures and support surfaces present in wheelchair prescription, we're only going to be focusing on those measures used in the basic training package. And again, the basic training package means that someone's able to attain this neutral sitting posture without a whole lot of extra supports. Next slide, please, Krithika. Yep, so as I said, we're mostly today going to focus on body users, and we're mostly reflecting the wheelchair user, because next week when we talk about the prescription of the chair, we'll look a little bit more then at the wheelchair components. Okay, so we know the body measures are divided into 2 main categories. They're divided into linear measures and angular measures. Now, the basic manual does not include angular measures, so they won't be discussed in this webinar. However, I've just put them up here for the sake of completion. So you know the body measures are divided into those 2 things. And Kelly Waugh's publication does streamline language for both of those, both the linear measures as well as the angular measures, but we will be focusing on linear measures today. So if you look at the next slide, what you'll see, we have 3 columns here. On the far left are terms that were used and suggested in the WHO original guidelines. And then you'll see in the middle column, the revised terms, and then you'll see the definition on the far right. So you can see that much of the colloquial language did come from the WHO guidelines. So you see things like hip width, seat depth, calf length, things like that. If we look at the revised terminology, we still refer to hip width as hip width. However, rather than seat depth, we're talking about thigh depth. So we're talking about the measure of the user. Seat depth can make one think that you're talking about the seat of the wheelchair. However, we're actually just talking about the person at the state, so we're looking at the thigh depth. Same with calf length. We're trying to streamline the information, so we're looking at lower leg length. So actually, Krithika, you're right. As you go on to the next slide, what you can see here is those are the names of those are the new updated terms, or they're not actually all that new, they're from 2013, but those are the terms that we're recommending we now use when we're talking about measuring different body parts. And so if we go on to the next terminology, throughout the manual, we've also changed the words pressure sore into pressure injury, and more people are starting to do this. However, the WHO manual still refers to pressure injuries as pressure sores. And so this is one of the other terminology changes. that was done so due to published recommendations. And in this case, this is recommended by the National Pressure Ulcer Advisory Panel. So if we go to the next slide, there's actually a definition for pressure injury, and I'll read it right off for you. But a pressure injury is localized damage to the skin and or underlying soft tissue, usually over a bony prominence or related to a medical or other device. The injury can present as intact skin or an open ulcer and may be painful. The injury occurs as a result of intense and or prolonged pressure or pressure in combination with shear. The tolerance of soft tissue for pressure and shear may also be affected by microclimatic, nutrition, perfusion, comorbidities, and condition of the soft tissue. So that is the current definition of what a pressure injury is. And so if we go to the next slide, again, why are we changing this terminology? Well, what the National Pressure Injury Panel is saying is that this change more accurately describes pressure injuries to both intact and ulcerated skin. So in earlier staging systems that were described under the pressure ulcer terminology, stage 1 described a suspected tissue injury and other stages described open ulcers. And this led to confusion because some people weren't sure if a stage 1 was actually stage 1 because it was suspected tissue injury rather than an open ulcer. And so there's a lot of mix up when it comes to terminologies. So if we go to the next slide, you can see now that all stages are referred to as pressure injuries. And so the word sore has been taken out of the terminology altogether. So you can see we have a stage 1 pressure injury, 2, 3, and 4 pressure injury. And then we also have unstageable and deep tissue pressure injuries. But again, throughout, what you see is the word injury and not ulcer. So those were the primary terminology updates that we recommended for this module. In terms of organization, we did move around some of the information that was put out by the WHO, and mostly when it actually described this a little bit to you. So if we go to the next slide, as I said before, you can see that the WHO had these 8 steps, and that's highlighted on the left with that picture, and then the WHO 8 steps here in the blue, and then the core knowledge. And so what the core knowledge meant is that the core knowledge was essentially that theoretical information, and then all the practical stuff was hidden within those WHO 8 steps in their original publication. What we've done now is we've combined everything in terms of the theoretical and the practical information for each step, and we put it together in one spot. So if we go to the next slide, what you can see is that we have put introduction, so just some basic introductory information is housed in an introduction to the manual there on the far right. And if we go down to steps 1 and 2, if we go into the next slide, what you can see is that we have sitting upright as well as B1 through B4 is housed in steps 1 and 2. And although sitting upright A4 is not directly talked about in the introduction and in steps 1 and 2, they are referred to throughout the module or throughout the manual. So we spoke about those changes first because pressure injury comes up in almost all sections of the WHO guidelines. So if we go to the next slide, so that's some examples of how we reorganized information among the modules, combining theoretical and practical information, as well reorganized information within the modules. Now, if we go to the next slide, we didn't actually reorganize any information within steps 1 and 2 because we felt that those had been presented appropriately. However, when we move on to steps 3 and 4 and 5 through 8, we did do some recommendations for changing that organization. And as I had said earlier, no content was added to steps 1 and 2. We felt that the content put forward by the WHO guidelines was quite exhaustive in nature. And so we really just felt that those changes in terminology were important. So in summary, if we go to the next slide, significant updates to terminology were made throughout steps 1 and 2. And this was because we combined theoretical, and then we also combined theoretical and practical information pertaining to assessment, and we didn't deem any content additions necessary. If you go to the next slide, what you'll see is these are the resources that we used for steps 1 and 2. There's the glossary of wheelchair terms and definitions that I spoke about, mentioned the clinical application guide to standardize wheelchair seating measures and body and support surfaces. We'll talk about both of those a little bit more next week. We mentioned the National Pressure Injury Advisory Panel. And then the subject matter experts who we had weigh in on this were Kelly Waugh, Jean-Ann Sollers, and Sharon Sonnenblum. So if we go to the next slide, that's what the presentation we just gave provides our updates to the introduction section as well as steps 1 and 2. And then next week, we'll be looking at similar information for steps 3 and 4, and then as we go through the rest. So thank you very much. If we go to the next slide, what you can see is, again, we just wanted to cover steps 1 and 2, which are referral and assessment, and that's what we've done today. So I guess now would be a good time to ask if anybody has any questions.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, my name is Maha.
Hi, Maha.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Sorry, I couldn't join at the very beginning, but I have a quick question about the terminology part, because you mentioned seed depth as an example, and I have another term that I always get it confused with, so I wasn't sure if there was any update to it, which is the difference. It's kind of a depth in the wheelchair from the front of the thigh to the back. You know, there is a little bit of an incline when the client is sitting, like kind of at the hip angle, if you want to say, the flexion. Usually we don't have it 90, we have it a little bit more so that, you know, the weight is tilted backwards. What do you call this? Is there a new terminology for it?
So Maha, we don't have that in this webinar. However, if you go, Krithika, can you share the screen to slide 57? What you'll see, Maha, there is those 2 publications. They're freely available, the Glossary of Wheelchair Terms and Definitions, as well as this Clinical Application Guide to Standardized Wheelchair. Those first 2 on the list there, those are freely downloadable PDFs, and they each have almost 30 pages of these updated terms. So if you go there, you can see what the updated term is for that angle. Because that angle is called 2 different things. If you're measuring the angle on the person, it's called one thing. And if you're measuring that angle on the chair, it's called something else. So if you go there, it will that PDF document that you can download will tell you what the terminology should be.
Okay, I will definitely check it. Thank you so much.
Amira, can I expand a little bit regarding Maha's comment?
Yeah, absolutely.
So as you all know, there are linear measures and angular measures, and within WHO and ISWP modules, we only talk about the linear ones, but Maha was referring to an angular measure. So the angles can be measured in the frontal plane, so those will be frontal angles, in the sagittal plane from the side, and in the transversal plane from the top. So if we are looking at a person from the side and we want to see, and I have a let go here, that can be helpful. So were you referring, Maha, to the seat looking from the side?
Yes.
Perfect. So
I just saw your comment, so yeah.
Yes, that is called the sagittal seat angle. And if you're looking to the side of the person from the side, that will be the tight sagittal angle. But yes, what Amira mentioned is it's perfect. Just make sure that you can download those resources. Those are 2 amazing books that can help us understand how to appropriately call all these different measures. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Can I ask a question too? It's Andre.
Of course you can.
Okay. Back in 2014, we dissected those manuals and used them in our clinic over the last 8 years. So they're not easy. So will you guys be teaching this in the next steps? Because it's not just about reading those manuals. No one will know how to apply them.
Yeah. And so I think when we look at some of these more educational things in these webinars that we have coming up is just this, essentially. It's our recommendations for the updates. However, we have another set of webinars that are training webinars by experts, and we're always looking for topics that people may want. And so, that's a great topic if that's something people are interested in. I do think we have one. I think Jean-Ann Zollers, who was one of our previous, you saw her name there as one of our subject matter experts. She's doing a webinar on some angles and measurements in the fall, I believe. I'm not sure if she's going to include that, but if not, that's something we could certainly follow up with a training webinar for.
Oh, okay, because I had to call Kelly and ask her, this is too much. I don't know how to use it. And she walked me through it. And we actually put a good presentation together back in 2014. If you want us to go through it. And it's
we love it. If you're interested in giving
helpful. It really changed our practice a lot.
Oh, Andre, that's great to hear. If you want to send us your email address, we would love if you would like to assist with that.
Sure, if you want to. Yeah, I still
Absolutely.
have a presentation. I'd have to update it a bit.
Absolutely. Yeah. Please do.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Andre. I already have your email address, so I will touch base with you for more information. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Thank you all for joining us. This was our first in this series, so we're happy to see such a nice turnout.
Thank you for your time and presentation.
Thank you, everybody. I will send reminders for our next webinar, and we hope to see you on April 15th. Thank you so much.